Assalamu alaikum. The cell. The cell is the smallest living unit in the body, and the body is composed of billions of small cells. Each cell contains organelles, and the main organelles are the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and the mitochondria. The space inside the cell is the cytoplasm. The substances can move inside the cytoplasm. They don't fly, but they swim in the cytosol, the fluid that makes the cytoplasm, which is the fluid that fills the cell. There are a lot of different cell types. In human body, there are more than 200 different types of cells. But in general classification, cells are divided into two groups: eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Before talking about the differences between these groups, let's first take more information about the cell structure and organelles. Every cell has a membrane. It is called cell membrane or plasma membrane. It's a barrier that separates what's inside the cell from the outside. This membrane is mainly made up of a phospholipid bilayer, and there are also proteins that float between these phospholipids. Let's talk about the phospholipid structure. It has two parts, the head and the tail. The head part is made of the negatively charged phosphate group, which makes it hydrophilic. And the tail part is made up of two fatty acids. And because it is fatty, that makes it hydrophobic. In the bilayer, the head parts are facing out, and the tail parts are facing in. So head is out, tails in. This is because the head part is hydrophilic, so it is the part that will interact with the aqueous medium outside and inside the cell. This membrane is selectively permeable, or we can call it semi-permeable. This means that it allows certain substances to pass through it, like oxygen or carbon dioxide, while not allowing others, like water molecules or glucose. As for the compounds or ions that cannot pass through, the membrane contains enzymes on its surface that allow their passage under certain conditions. Finally, a cell cannot continue to live if its membrane is damaged. As most living creatures need a skeleton to make its shape, the cell also has a cytoskeleton, and we'll talk more about the cytoskeleton in future videos of this series. Let's talk about some of the organelles in the cell. The nucleus. It's an organelle surrounded by a membrane similar to the cell membrane, containing all the genetic information of the cell. This genetic information is in the form of chromosomes, which are huge DNA complexes tightly coiled and packaged. Detailed information about DNA will be discussed in biochemistry series, but simply, it's a nucleic acids that contains millions of atoms. Some parts of the DNA are called genes. That's the genetic functional units that codes for proteins. It is first transcribed, then translated into a protein form. And the molecules responsible for translation are ribosomes. That's why the ribosomes are considered an essential component for the cell. Some even consider them as an organelles. The mitochondria is an organelle surrounded by two membranes. Its main function in the cell is to produce energy. The energy they produce is in the form of ATP molecules, which you can consider the unit of currency in the body. To produce energy, mitochondria need oxygen, which will enter by osmosis through the membrane. There are other organelles in the cell, like endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus. We'll talk about them in detail when we discuss eukaryotic cells later in this series. Normally, the cell size is on average 0.01 millimeters or 10 micrometers. This size may differ from one cell to another, depending on the cell type, function, and location. If we look at large organisms, take the elephant for example, they don't have larger cells. They rather have more cells of the same average size. This was the summary of the lesson. Now let's do a quick review. The cell is the smallest living unit in the body. It contains organelles. They are nucleus, which contains the genetic information in DNA format, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, and mitochondria that generates the power in ATP format using oxygen. All cell components are floating in the cytoplasm. The cell contains a special membrane made of phospholipid bilayer, in which the head part that contains the negative phosphate is facing out, and the tail part containing the fatty acid is facing in. This concludes our discussion about the cell. If you want to test your knowledge by solving the questions, continue the video. We've said that the cytosol is the fluid that fills the cell, and all cell components float in it. We've said that the head part of the phospholipid contains the negatively charged phosphate group. We said that the ATP is the energy unit of the body, and it is made by the mitochondria.